They called him President of the People's Republic of China, a founding father of the revolution, a man who once stood shoulder to shoulder with Mao. But in Mao's China, standing too close to the sun meant burning alive. In 1966, the Cultural Revolution began its descent into madness. And Mao chose his next target, not a traitor, not an enemy, but his own second-in-command, Liu Shaoqi. What followed was not a trial, not a purge. It was a slow execution engineered through humiliation, torture, and finally, starvation. According to historian Roderick MacFarquhar, Liu's final months were a form of political murder hidden behind revolutionary slogans. This is the story of the man who rose to the presidency and died anonymous in a freezing cell. His name erased, his body left to rot in secrecy. This is Dictators Files, the death of Liu Shaoqi. Before Liu Shaoqi became a target, he was Mao's most trusted builder. Born in 1898 in Hunan, the same province as Mao, Liu did not come from privilege or military glory. He came from fields, poverty, and the world of peasants, the group the revolution claimed to fight for. By the 1920s, Liu joined the nascent Chinese Communist Party, not as a soldier, not as a war hero, but as an organizer, a strategist, a man who understood how to control people without raising his voice. Historian Maurice Meisner calls Liu the party's master of discipline, a man who believed the revolution needed order, rules, structure. While Mao dreamed in sweeping slogans, Liu built the machine that made those dreams real. In the 1930s, during the Jiangxi Soviet and later the Long March, Liu wasn't standing beside Mao waving a rifle. He was in the shadows, writing party regulations, managing underground networks, enforcing political loyalty in the most dangerous years of the CCP. By 1945, as the communists prepared for civil war, Liu was already one of the party's most respected theorists. He spoke softly. He worked relentlessly. And unlike many others around Mao, he had no personal cult, only competence. After the communist victory in 1949, Liu became vice chairman of the party, effectively Mao's second-in-command. By 1959, at the peak of Mao's political crisis after the disastrous Great Leap Forward, the party made a historic decision. They replaced Mao as head of state with Liu Shaoqi. Historian Roderick MacFarquhar writes, Liu became the man responsible for rescuing China from Mao's economic catastrophe. And he did. Liu reversed collectivization. He allowed peasant markets. He stopped the famine from getting worse. It was the single greatest act of disobedience Mao had ever faced. Not because Liu opposed him publicly, but because Liu succeeded where Mao had failed. For a dictator, there is no greater crime. By 1962, whispers began in Mao's circle that Liu was too pragmatic, too rational, too popular among the party elites. Mao heard every whisper, recorded every doubt, and he waited for the moment he would strike. Liu Shaoqi had risen higher than any civilian leader in the history of the PRC. And in Mao's China, the higher a man stands, the farther he can be made to fall. Liu Shaoqi didn't know it yet, but by 1963, Mao had already marked him. The Great Leap Forward had killed tens of millions. Liu had helped reverse the famine, and in doing so, he exposed Mao's failure to the entire party. Mao never forgot humiliation. He never forgave it. Historian Frank Dikötter writes that Mao viewed Liu's reforms as a personal insult, a reminder that he could lose control of his revolution. So Mao began to rebuild his power, quietly, deliberately. He toured the countryside. He met radical students. He revived old allies. And in every speech, every meeting, every carefully placed phrase, he planted one idea. Revisionists are infiltrating the party. He never said Liu's name. He didn't need to. By 1965, Mao crafted the perfect weapon, a campaign that targeted bourgeois authority, capitalist tendencies, and leaders taking the capitalist road. A campaign vague enough to point anywhere, powerful enough to destroy anyone. All it needed was ignition, and Mao lit the first match in May 1966, when he allowed a small group of radical students in Beijing University to post a big character poster accusing their teachers of betraying the revolution. This was the moment the Cultural Revolution was born, and Mao made sure it spread like a virus. Historian Michael Schoenhals describes Mao's method. He let the flames rise, then stepped back to watch who burned. Within weeks, chaos exploded. Students attacked officials. Red Guard groups formed. Slogans filled the streets. Schools closed. Workplaces rioted. And Mao? He swam in the Yangtze River before the cameras, broadcasting strength, vitality, domination, a message to the nation. I am back. Liu Shaoqi watched all of this in horror. He knew chaos. He had survived prison, war, purges, famine. But he had never seen anything like this. The Cultural Revolution wasn't a political campaign. It was a purification ritual. And Mao was preparing the altar. In meetings, Liu warned Mao, "Without order, the country will collapse." But Mao only smiled. Historian Elizabeth Perry notes that Mao interpreted Liu's warnings not as concern, but as evidence of guilt, proof that Liu feared the masses. And Mao had decided anyone who feared the masses could be crushed by them. By summer 1966, Red Guards across China received a new target list: capitalist roaders in the party. At the top of that list, printed on posters, shouted in rallies, screamed by teenagers drunk on ideology, Liu Shaoqi, the president of China, Mao's former comrade, now condemned as the biggest capitalist roader. The trap was ready. The mob was primed. The dictator was satisfied. And Liu Shaoqi's fall was about to begin. By late 1966, China was no longer a country. It was a frenzy. Red Guards marched through the streets shouting Mao's name, smashing homes, dragging officials from their beds. Anything old was destroyed. Anything suspect was attacked. And in that tidal wave of chaos, Mao unleashed his next order: struggle the capitalist roader, Liu Shaoqi. Historian Roderick MacFarquhar says the directive was not public, but it didn't need to be. Every faction of the Red Guards understood what Mao wanted, so they came for him. Liu Shaoqi, President of the People's Republic of China, the man who once stood second only to Mao, was dragged before screaming mobs of teenagers barely old enough to shave. They yanked his hair, spat in his face, forced him into the airplane position, arms twisted behind his back, body bent forward until breathing became agony. Witnesses recalled Liu trembling from pain. He was 68 years old. At struggle sessions, Red Guard shouted, "Down with Liu Shaoqi! Beat the traitor! Smash the capitalist rotor!" Battered, bleeding, barely able to stand. Liu refused to confess, and Mao noticed. Historian Michael Schoenhals writes that Mao became fixated on Liu's silence. He wanted to break him completely. So the attacks escalated. Red Guard stormed Liu's home. They beat his children. They tortured his wife, Wang Guangmei, forcing her to wear a necklace made of ping-pong balls to mock her bourgeois elegance. Then Mao ordered the party to investigate Liu formally. The verdict was predetermined. Traitor, secret agent, enemy of the revolution. Liu Shaoqi was expelled from every position he had ever held. His portraits removed, his writings banned, his name erased from speeches, textbooks, even photographs. Historian MacFarquhar described it bluntly. Mao did not want to defeat Liu politically. He wanted to destroy him existentially. By 1967, the humiliation was no longer public. It became quiet, disciplined, methodical. Liu was placed under house arrest. No visitors, no letters, no doctors he could trust. His world shrank to a few rooms and the boots of the guards who watched him. The man who once represented the state now represented nothing. And the Cultural Revolution machine, the machine Liu once helped build, turned its grinding gears toward the final phase: punishment without mercy. Liu Shaoqi was not being investigated. He was being processed, prepared for his final disappearance. By 1968, Liu Shaoqi had vanished from public life. No speeches, no photographs, no official announcements. A man who once ruled the nation was erased like chalk from a blackboard. Historian Jonathan Spence notes that even senior party members whispered the same question: "Where is the president?" Mao gave no answer. He didn't need to. Liu's purge was no longer political. It was personal. In the freezing hours before dawn, October 1968, guards entered Liu's home. They said nothing. They grabbed him, sick, frail, barely able to stand, and shoved him into a vehicle with blacked-out windows. This was not an arrest. It was a disappearance. Liu was transported to a secret detention site in Kaifeng, Henan Province. The facility had one purpose: to break political prisoners slowly, quietly, without witnesses. Historian Maurice Meisner writes that Mao's inner circle chose Kaifeng precisely because this was a place from which no truth could escape. Liu's new room was a tiny concrete box. No bedding, no furniture, just a wooden board, a bucket, and a dim light that stayed on 24 hours a day. His guards were given explicit orders: no medical treatment unless approved, no communication, no softness, no pity. Liu Shaoqi, former president, was now prisoner number 1, a secret so dangerous that even his jailers were forbidden to speak his name. Liu suffered from asthma, diabetes, ulcers, and pneumonia. Inside that damp cell, his conditions worsened rapidly. Food came in bowls shoved under the door: cold rice, spoiled vegetables, sometimes nothing at all. Historian Elizabeth Perry describes Liu's confinement as the controlled collapse of a human being. By early 1969, he could barely walk. His weight dropped drastically. His skin peeled from untreated infections. He coughed blood into his blanket. When low-ranking guards suggested medical care, the order came back. Let the capitalist rotor fade on his own. While Liu was disappearing inside Kaifeng, his wife Wang Guangmei was imprisoned elsewhere, being tortured in her own cell. Their children were beaten in schools and forced to denounce their father. His daughter, Liu Tingting, later recalled, "We knew he was alive only because they hadn't told us he was dead." The silence was the torture. The waiting was the punishment. Mao never visited Kaifeng. He never needed to. Brief reports arrived on his desk every few weeks. Liu is deteriorating. Liu is weak. Liu is failing to stand. Historian Dikötter states that Mao's response was always the same. Continue. Liu's destruction was the message, a warning to anyone who dared to think independently. A lesson carved into the body of a man who had once outranked every official in China, except Mao himself. By late 1969, Liu Shaoqi was no longer being held for interrogation. There were no more questions to ask. The dictator was simply waiting for the president to die. By 1970, Liu Shaoqi was no longer a political prisoner. He was a dying man, and Mao wanted him to die slowly. The guards at Kaifeng received a new set of instructions, not written, not official, delivered verbally to avoid records. Historian Roderick MacFarquhar summarizes the order in 3 chilling words: no treatment, no comfort, no noise. From this point on, Liu's death was not an accident. It was policy. Liu's daily rations were reduced until they barely qualified as food. Watery porridge, bitter cabbage, sometimes a handful of cold millet. Nothing more. He was already frail, already sick. Starvation did the rest. His legs thinned into sticks. His face collapsed inward. His teeth loosened. His skin tore at the slightest touch. Historian Michael Schoenhals notes that medical records later showed severe malnutrition, consistent with prolonged food deprivation. Liu began hallucinating near the end. He called out for water, for medicine, sometimes for his wife. The guards were ordered not to respond. As his immune system failed, pneumonia devoured him. His breathing became shallow, desperate, a wet rattle echoing through the tiny concrete room. A doctor was finally allowed to examine him, but only to record the decline, not to stop it. One witness later recalled, "His lungs were drowning him. He was suffocating in slow motion." Mao was updated. Mao did not intervene. This was the same Liu Shaoqi who had helped rebuild the country after the Great Leap Forward. The same man who had once stood at Mao's side during national celebrations. The same president whose speeches were broadcast across China. Now he lay on a wooden plank, unable to lift his head, coughing blood onto a blanket the guards refused to wash. Historian Maurice Meisner writes, "Liu's death was not a moment. It was a long disintegration engineered by the party he helped create." In early 1971, Liu tried to speak. The guards leaned in. His voice was barely audible. "I am still a member of the Communist Party." That was Liu's final plea. A plea Mao would never hear, or never care to hear. the guards turned away. By autumn 1971, Liu was delirious, drifting in and out of consciousness. He no longer recognized faces. He no longer asked questions. He no longer resisted. His body was failing in every possible way. Starvation, pneumonia, diabetes, bed sores, infection. Death was no longer hypothetical. It was in the room with him. Only one thing was still missing: permission. And that came soon. The party issued the final directive: handle Liu Shaoqi quietly. A euphemism historians recognize for what it was, the green light to let him die. On November 12, 1969, Liu Shaoqi's body finally failed. It was early morning, cold, silent, no doctors, no family, no comrades. Only 2 guards outside a door they were forbidden to open. Inside, Liu lay twisted on the wooden board that had served as his bed for more than a year. The official internal report, later uncovered by historians Roderick MacFarquhar and Michael Schoenhals, stated that Liu died from complications of pneumonia under conditions of extreme malnutrition. But his death was not a medical event. It was the final step in an execution carried out without trial or bullet. A guard later described hearing the last sound: a shallow exhale, then nothing. When they finally unlocked the door, Liu's eyes were open, his mouth slightly parted, his hands curled inward like claws. He weighed barely more than a child. There were no last words, no witnesses, just a man who once led a nation, dying alone in a freezing cell. Historian Elizabeth Perry wrote the starkest line ever published about his end. Liu Shaoqi was not killed by an enemy. He was allowed to die by his chairman. The guards were given strict instructions: no autopsy, no photos, no announcement. Liu's body was wrapped in a cheap blanket, tied with rope, and taken out the back of the detention facility. No coffin, no flag, no name. He was transported to a remote crematorium in Kaifeng. No ceremony, no witness except a small party team assigned to process the remains. His ashes were placed into a plain jar. No label, no record. The identity of the man inside that jar was known only to a handful of people. Back in Beijing, senior officials whispered rumors. Some believed Liu was alive. Some believed he was near death. None knew the truth. Not even his wife, Wang Guangmei, still imprisoned, still suffering, was told he had died. Their children were kept in the dark as well. They were teenagers, and the regime wanted them to continue confessing against a father who no longer existed. It would be 7 years before they learned the truth. When news of Liu's death reached Mao, his reaction was recorded by one witness: a nod. Nothing else. No tears. No celebration. Just an acknowledgement that a loose end had been tied. Historian Frank Dikötter writes that Mao saw Liu's death as a necessary demonstration of revolutionary justice. In other words, a warning. With Liu Shaoqi dead, Mao had eliminated the last major political rival of his early revolutionary circle. But the dictator was not finished. He wanted Liu erased, not just physically, but historically. And in Mao's China, erasure was an art form. Liu Shaoqi was dead. But Mao understood something. A dictator's victory is not complete until the memory of the victim is destroyed. And so it began. After Liu's death in 1969, Mao issued quiet, internal directives. Liu's name must not be spoken. His image must be removed from all archives. His writings must be confiscated. His family must remain imprisoned or isolated. Historian Maurice Meisner describes Mao's approach simply, erase the man and the lesson remains. In the party's official publications, Liu's name vanished. In textbooks, his achievements were reassigned to others. Photographs were cropped so that Liu's face disappeared from group portraits. The president of China had become a ghost. Wang Guangmei, Liu's wife, remained in prison. She was tortured, humiliated, starved. Yet no one told her that her husband was already dead. Liu's children were forced to attend struggle sessions, where they denounced their father, to survive. Historian Michael Schoenhals notes that one of Liu's sons asked a guard in 1970, "Can I see my father?" The guard replied, "He is being re-educated." It was a lie. Liu had been ashes for months. There was no tombstone, no ceremony, no mourning period, just a secret jar of ashes in a drawer at a Kaifeng crematorium. Even the workers did not know whose remains they were handling. Mao wanted nothing left, not even a grave that could become a symbol. Then, everything changed. After Mao's death in 1976, the new leadership, desperate to stabilize the country, began reviewing the Cultural Revolution's crimes. In 1978, the Communist Party quietly admitted the truth. Liu Shaoqi had been wrongfully persecuted. He had died from abuse in custody. He was not a traitor. His ashes were finally returned to Beijing. His family was allowed to mourn. A full state funeral was broadcast on national television in 1980. Historian Roderick MacFarquhar writes, "It was the biggest political reversal in the history of the People's Republic. Suddenly the man Mao tried to erase was reborn into the official narrative as a hero, a martyr, a victim of tyranny. But the truth was darker than the funeral admitted. Mao had starved Liu deliberately. Mao had denied him medical care. Mao had ordered the erasure of his memory. Mao had killed the president of China in slow motion. A dictatorship can rewrite textbooks. It can burn photos. It can silence families. But it cannot change the fact that Liu Shaoqi died because one man, one dictator, wanted him gone. And that is why his story must be told, not as a tragedy, but as a warning.